The moment I stepped into the apartment, it felt right. It was small, yes, but it was mine. After years of moving from one shared space to another, I was ready for something of my own, even if it was just this modest one-bedroom on the outskirts of the city. The rent was reasonable, the area quiet, and best of all, it was a space I could shape to my liking. No more tiptoeing around roommates' habits or schedules. This place was a fresh start. The building itself was older, maybe from the 1970s, with the usual quirks of an aging structure. The hallway leading to my door smelled faintly of cleaning products and mildew, the paint peeling slightly at the edges, but I figured I could live with it. It added character, I thought. The apartment had a certain charm too: wooden floors, a decent kitchen, a view of the tree-lined street below. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. The first night after I moved in, I went through the usual ritual of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. The work was exhausting, but satisfying. The routine of it kept my mind occupied, and by the time I finished, I was too tired to do anything but fall into bed. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I could hear the muffled sounds of the building around me, the hum of distant traffic, footsteps from the apartment above, and the occasional creak of the walls settling. It was normal. Old buildings made noise, I reminded myself. That's just how it is. But there was one sound that stood out. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, like a soft, rhythmic pulse. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe from the heating system or plumbing. I turned on my side, trying to ignore it. Moving into a new place can be disorienting, especially when you're not used to the sounds of the building. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The next few days were uneventful. I settled into my new routine, going to work, coming home, and slowly making the apartment feel like mine. I found a local cafe down the street, started exploring the neighborhood a bit, and even managed to meet one or two of my neighbors. Everyone was polite but kept to themselves. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, low-key, uneventful. But that sound, that faint rhythmic pulse, kept coming back. At first I only noticed it at night, when the apartment was still, and there was nothing else to distract me. I'd be lying in bed, trying to relax, and there it was, a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, like breathing. It was faint enough that I could almost ignore it, but persistent enough that once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself lying awake again, listening to that sound. It seemed to move, or maybe it was just my imagination, but I could swear it wasn't coming from one fixed place. It shifted, first near the bedroom, then closer to the living room. But every time I got up to investigate, it stopped. I checked the windows, thinking maybe it was something outside, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual sounds of the city, muffled and distant. I started to rationalize it. The building was old, after all. Maybe it was something in the walls, pipes, or the ventilation system. I convinced myself it was something explainable, even though I couldn't quite pinpoint where it was coming from. I told myself it didn't matter. I just needed to adjust to the quirks of the place. Besides, there was no one else around to notice it, and none of my neighbors had mentioned anything strange. But then, one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I'd been home for a few hours, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, the faint hum of the TV in the background. The apartment felt cozy, almost comforting, and I was beginning to feel like I was finally settling in. That's when I heard it again, that same rhythmic sound, but this time it was louder, and for the first time it seemed to follow me. I got up from the couch, thinking maybe I could track it down. As I walked from the living room to the kitchen, the sound seemed to shift. It was still faint, but now it was more noticeable, like someone softly exhaling just behind me. I paused, turning around, expecting to find something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing. The apartment was empty, just as it had always been. Feeling uneasy, I turned on more lights, as if that would somehow drive away the strange sensation. I checked the vents, the windows, even the floorboards, but there was no obvious source for the sound. It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't some appliance or piece of furniture. It just existed. After a while, the sound seemed to fade, leaving me feeling foolish for getting so worked up over something that was probably just the building's plumbing or some other harmless quirk. Still, that night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was waiting for that sound to come back, waiting to hear it again. In the following days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I threw myself into work, met up with friends, and did anything I could to avoid being alone in the apartment for too long. But no matter how busy I kept myself, that feeling of unease lingered. The sound didn't go away. It was always there, just at the edge of my awareness, especially at night. Then, one evening, while I was in the middle of cooking dinner, I heard it again, clearer this time, as if someone was standing right behind me, breathing steadily just out of sight. I stopped what I was doing, heart racing, and turned slowly, expecting to find someone, or something, standing in the doorway. But again, the room was empty. This time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't just the pipes or the walls. Something about the way the sound seemed to follow me was too specific, too deliberate. I turned off the stove, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside for some air. For the first time since moving in, I felt genuinely unnerved. And that's when I decided I had to find out what was really going on in this apartment. It wasn't like me to get so spooked. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or paranormal nonsense, and I'd never been prone to anxiety or overthinking things. But ever since that night when the sound seemed to follow me from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the apartment. Rationally, I kept telling myself there was an explanation. Every old building had its quirks, right? Maybe it was the ventilation system, or maybe the walls were thinner than I thought, and I was just hearing the neighbors' movements somehow. But it wasn't just the sound itself, it was the feeling that came with it. A sensation that wasn't easy to describe, like being observed when you know no one else is there. I started wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound was so consistent, so steady, it didn't feel like something I was imagining. The next day at work, I decided to do some digging. During my lunch break, I searched online for anything about strange noises in apartments. There were the usual results: old buildings settling, faulty pipes, drafts in poorly insulated walls, but nothing that matched the specific rhythmic pattern I was hearing. I kept digging, reading through forums and articles, but still came up with nothing definitive. I was beginning to think I was alone in this, that it was just some weird thing about the apartment I'd have to live with, but something in me couldn't let it go. That evening, when I got home, I decided I would try and trace the source of the sound more methodically. It started almost on cue. As soon as the apartment settled into its evening quiet, there it was, the soft, rhythmic pulse, like someone breathing slowly in the background. I stood in the center of the living room, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It felt louder tonight, or maybe I was just more attuned to it. Either way, it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. I started walking around the apartment, pausing every few steps to listen. The sound didn't get louder or softer, but it always seemed to be nearby, no matter where I stood. I checked the vents, leaning in close, trying to detect anything that might be causing it, but there was nothing. I pressed my ear against the walls, half expecting to hear a neighbor's TV or conversation, but all I could hear was the steady pulse. Growing more frustrated, I moved into the kitchen and turned off all the appliances. Maybe the refrigerator or the microwave was emitting some kind of sound I hadn't noticed before. But when everything was off, the sound was still there, unchanged. It wasn't mechanical, it was too soft, too human. Next, I decided to check the windows again. I opened each one, listening for any street noise, but the sound didn't seem to be coming from outside. I even went so far as to stand in the hallway outside my apartment, wondering if it was something in the building itself. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, the noise disappeared, leaving only the usual hum of the building. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the stale hallway air, trying to think of what to do next. I felt ridiculous. It was just a sound after all, but the longer it persisted, the more it seemed like something I needed to figure out. Not just because it was unsettling, but because I couldn't let it go. I couldn't live with this constant, unnerving presence in my home. Back inside, I resumed my search, this time moving into the bedroom. It was the one place I hadn't fully checked yet, mostly because I dreaded the idea that the sound might be strongest where I slept. I stood in the middle of the room, listening intently, and there it was again, faint but steady, like it had been all along. I crouched down, checking under the bed, even though I knew there was nothing there. The floorboards creaked slightly as I shifted my weight, but that rhythmic pulse remained constant. I moved toward the closet next, pulling the door open and rifling through my clothes and boxes, but there was nothing unusual. No hidden vents, no odd wiring, nothing. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall, feeling defeated. I had tried everything, and yet the sound persisted, as if it was mocking my attempts to understand it. And then I realized something. I had been trying to track it down physically, like it was a problem I could solve by moving things around or turning off devices. But what if it wasn't something in the apartment? What if it was something in the apartment's history? The thought made my skin prickle. I didn't like the direction my mind was going, but I couldn't ignore the fact that nothing I had done so far made a difference. I grabbed my laptop and sat at the kitchen table, determined to find out more about the building. It didn't take long to track down basic information. The building was constructed in the early 70s, as I suspected, and had gone through several ownership changes over the years. But what caught my attention was an article buried deep in an old local news archive. The headline read, "Body discovered weeks after tenant's death in local apartment." My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on the link. The article was brief, a few paragraphs detailing how the body of a middle-aged man had been found in his apartment several weeks after he had passed away. Neighbors had complained about a smell, leading the landlord to enter the unit. By then, the body had decomposed, and the man had been dead for nearly a month. I read on, my eyes scanning for details. The article didn't mention which unit the man had lived in, but it did say that the building's ventilation system had been faulty at the time, which had delayed the discovery of the body. For weeks, the man's decomposing body had been releasing gases into the air, and it wasn't until the smell became overwhelming that anyone realized something was wrong. I sat there staring at the screen, my mind racing. Could it be? Could the strange sound I was hearing be connected to that? It seemed far-fetched, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made any sense. The ventilation system, the pipes. It had to be something left over from that, right? Some lingering effect of the tragedy that had taken place in the building all those years ago. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was a rational explanation, the thought of it unsettled me deeply. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, something I wasn't seeing yet. And as I sat there, the rhythmic sound continued, steady and unrelenting. It was as if the apartment itself was breathing. After reading that article, I couldn't shake the image of the decomposing tenant from my mind. It was disturbing enough that someone had died alone in this building and remained undiscovered for weeks. But what really gnawed at me was the possibility that I had moved into the very same apartment. The sound I'd been hearing, steady, like someone breathing, felt all too connected to the story. The next morning, I decided to take things further. I wasn't satisfied with what I had learned online. I needed to know for sure if this apartment had been the site of that tragedy. I also wanted to know more about who that man had been. Was there something about him that might explain the strange presence I was feeling? My first step was to visit the building's property management office. I figured they wouldn't give me detailed information about former tenants, but I hoped they might at least tell me more about the apartment itself. I had never met the landlord personally, only dealt with the office staff when signing my lease, but I was determined to get some answers. I walked over to the office, a small, unimpressive space tucked behind the main building. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up as I entered, giving me the bored, detached look of someone who dealt with too many tenant complaints. I cleared my throat and tried to sound casual. "Hi, I live in apartment 6B, I said, leaning on the counter. "I was wondering if you could tell me anything about the history of the unit. I'm just curious about who lived there before me." She frowned slightly, typing something into her computer. "Is there a problem with the unit?" she asked, without looking up. No problem," I replied, though I could hear the nervousness creeping into my voice. I heard something about the building's ventilation system being an issue a while back, and I was curious if it affected my apartment. I like to know the history of places I live, you know." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard. "The building's old," she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't want to deal with whatever concern I might bring up next. "There have been repairs over the years, sure, but we take care of any major issues. If you're having a problem, I can send maintenance." I shook my head quickly. "No, it's not that. It's just, was there ever an incident in that apartment? Like, did something happen to a former tenant?" Her eyes flickered with something like recognition. She glanced at the screen in front of her again, then back up at me, her expression guarded. "I'm not really supposed to share details about previous tenants," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "But there was an incident. It was a long time ago." I leaned in, my curiosity growing. An incident? What kind? The receptionist glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. Then, lowering her voice, she said, "A man passed away in the apartment a few years ago. Natural causes, I believe, but he wasn't found for a while. There was an issue with the ventilation system at the time, and..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable discussing it further. So, it was true. My stomach twisted as I realized I'd been right. I was living in the same apartment where that man had died. I thanked the receptionist and left the office, my mind racing. I had the confirmation I needed, but it didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it only made things worse. The idea that I had been hearing something connected to that man, or to his death, was too unsettling to ignore now. I couldn't just write it off as pipes or ventilation noises anymore. There was a connection between the sound and the history of the place, even if I couldn't fully explain it yet. Back in the apartment, I found myself more aware than ever of the space around me. Every corner, every wall felt heavy with the knowledge of what had happened here. I tried to keep myself busy, telling myself it was all in my head, but the sound was there again that night, steady and rhythmic, as if something was lingering just beneath the surface of normal life. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts kept returning to the article, to the details the receptionist had confirmed. I found myself wondering about the man who had died here. Who was he? How had he ended up alone, unnoticed for so long? I tried to picture his final moments. Did he know he was going to die? Had he tried to call for help, but no one heard him? The next morning, I decided I needed more information. I had to understand the full story. I couldn't keep living in this apartment with these half-formed suspicions lurking in the back of my mind. So, I turned back to the internet, this time searching more specifically for details about the man's death. It took a while, but I eventually found a few more references to the incident. The man's name was Michael Harris. He had been in his late 50s, lived alone, and from what I could gather, had no close family or friends nearby. His death had gone unnoticed for weeks, and by the time the building staff had discovered him, his body had already begun to decompose. The article mentioned that neighbors had complained about the smell, but it wasn't until the stench became overwhelming that anyone thought to check on him. Reading about Michael Harris sent a chill through me. The idea of dying alone, with no one to care or notice, was horrifying in itself. But something about the way the article described the discovery of his body stuck with me. It mentioned that the ventilation system had been pumping air from his apartment into the rest of the building, which was why it had taken so long for anyone to realize something was wrong. I thought back to the sound I'd been hearing, the rhythmic, breathing-like pulse. Could it really be that simple? Was I hearing something left over from that faulty ventilation system? Maybe it wasn't supernatural after all. Maybe it was just the remnants of old air, trapped in the ducts, still circulating through the building. But even as I considered that explanation, I couldn't shake the sense that there was more to it. I couldn't ignore how specific the sound felt, how it seemed to follow me, to shift in intensity depending on where I was in the apartment. It wasn't just an ambient noise, it felt alive. That evening, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly wondering and second-guessing myself. I needed to confront whatever was happening once and for all. I waited until nightfall, when the apartment was at its quietest, and then I sat in the living room, listening. The sound was there, as always, soft but present. I focused on it, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was faint at first, but after a few minutes, it grew louder, more distinct. I stood up and began to follow it, moving slowly through the apartment, from the living room to the kitchen, then back to the bedroom. The sound seemed to move with me, just as it had before. But this time, I wasn't going to let it scare me. I was going to face it head on. And then, as I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, something strange happened. The sound stopped. Complete silence filled the room. And for the first time, I felt truly alone in my apartment. That silence was heavier than any noise I had ever heard. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, as if the absence of the sound was more oppressive than its presence had ever been. I stood in the bedroom doorway, frozen, waiting for the pulse of that rhythmic noise to return, but it didn't. Instead, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city outside, muffled and distant. I tried to tell myself that this was a good thing. Maybe I had finally figured it out, or maybe the sound was just some odd quirk of the building that had now resolved itself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Something had shifted in the apartment, and the silence wasn't a relief. It was a warning. That night, I barely slept again. But it wasn't the sound keeping me awake this time. It was the absence of it, the way the apartment felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize everything that had happened. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't quite fit together. The ventilation system theory seemed plausible enough, but why had the sound felt so personal? Why had it seemed to follow me? By the time morning came, I was exhausted and jittery, unable to shake the unease that clung to me. I went through my day at work in a fog, barely able to focus. My mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to that silent, unsettling space I'd left behind. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend or even a professional, just to get another perspective. But what would I say? "Hey, I think my apartment might be haunted, but don't worry, it's probably just bad ventilation." I knew how ridiculous it sounded, and I wasn't about to embarrass myself over something I couldn't even explain properly. When I got home that evening, I half expected the sound to be waiting for me, picking up right where it had left off. But as I opened the door, I was greeted with the same thick silence. The apartment felt different now, not just quiet, but empty in a way it hadn't before. I set my keys on the counter, listening for any hint of the familiar noise, but all I heard was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I tried to settle into my usual routine, cooking dinner, watching TV, but everything felt off. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every little noise from outside the window felt like an intrusion. I was on edge, constantly waiting for the sound to come back, for the rhythm to start up again. But it didn't. The apartment remained silent, and with every passing hour, my anxiety grew. That night, as I lay in bed, I finally allowed myself to consider the possibility that something else might be going on, something beyond faulty pipes or old ductwork. I didn't want to believe it. I'm not the type of person who jumps to supernatural conclusions, but the strange consistency of the sound, its almost deliberate movements, and the way it had stopped so suddenly, all made me wonder if there was something more, something tied to the man who had died here, to Michael Harris. I thought about him a lot that night, imagining what his life had been like, what his final days had been like, alone, in this very apartment, unnoticed by anyone. I wondered if he had felt the same sense of isolation that I was feeling now, if he had heard the same noises, or if this was something new, something connected to his death, or maybe even to me. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. But it wasn't a restful sleep. My dreams were disjointed, full of fragmented images. Michael Harris's face, the empty hallways of the building, the rhythmic pulse of that sound echoing in the background. In one of the dreams, I was standing in the middle of the apartment, listening, waiting for the sound to start. But instead of hearing it, I saw it, ripples moving through the air, like invisible waves, and in the middle of those ripples was a figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the apartment still dark and silent around me. I lay there, disoriented, trying to shake the feeling of the dream, but it clung to me. The figure, the ripples, it felt too real, too vivid. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. That's when I heard it. It started quietly at first, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it, but as I lay there, holding my breath, it grew louder. The same rhythmic pulse, steady and soft, just like before. It was back. I sat up in bed, my heart racing again, and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the bedroom this time. It was coming from the living room. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, moving slowly toward the door. The sound grew louder as I got closer, still soft, but now unmistakable. It was as if someone was standing just beyond the living room, breathing slowly, deliberately. I stepped into the hallway, my feet moving almost on their own. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was tense, every muscle in my body on high alert. I told myself I was going to confront it. Whatever it was, there had to be an explanation. As I reached the living room, the sound seemed to shift, like it was moving again, just beyond the edge of my awareness. I stopped in the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, and listened. The pulse was steady now, louder than before, but still soft enough that it felt distant, like it was coming from just beyond the walls. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped again. I stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by silence, my breath shallow and my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where the sound had gone, or why it had stopped. All I knew was that it had come back, and this time it felt different, more deliberate, more aware. I glanced around the room, searching for anything out of place, but everything looked normal. Just my furniture, my belongings, the same space I had been living in for weeks. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the way the silence seemed to press against me, almost suffocating. I was no longer alone in the apartment. I backed slowly out of the living room, retreating to the hallway, my eyes scanning the space around me. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of the apartment and figure this out from a safe distance. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something was keeping me there, holding me in place, as if I needed to see this through, to find out what was really happening. I stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. The silence remained, thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a blanket. And then, just as I was about to turn and go back to bed, I heard something new. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse this time. It was a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under the weight of something or someone. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw it. There, in the doorway of the bedroom, stood a figure. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but it was there, unmoving, watching me. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt real fear. The kind of fear that grips you so tightly you can't move, can't think, can't breathe. And in that moment I knew, whatever had been making that sound wasn't just in the walls. It was here with me. For a moment I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the figure in the bedroom doorway. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, to fit it into the realm of reality, but nothing about this felt real. The figure was just standing there, barely more than a shadow, its shape indistinct, but unmistakably human. Every rational part of me wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a figment of my sleep-deprived mind. Maybe I was still dreaming, caught in the fog of that strange half-sleep state where everything feels off but plausible. But this wasn't a dream. The figure didn't move, but its presence was palpable, like the weight of eyes on you when someone is staring, that invisible pressure in the air that makes your skin crawl. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts, trying to force myself to think clearly. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of the apartment, but my legs didn't cooperate. Fear had a grip on me now, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. My mind raced through possibilities, desperate for an explanation. An intruder, a shadow, a reflection, but none of them made sense. I blinked hard, my vision blurring slightly as I did, and for a split second the figure seemed to waver, almost like it wasn't fully solid, but it was still there, still watching. A sudden thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. Michael Harris. Was this him? Was this what was left behind, lingering in the apartment after his death? The rational part of me recoiled at the idea, but after everything that had happened, the sound, the strange feelings, the way the apartment seemed to change, it was hard to shake. The figure had to be connected to him. There was no other explanation. I stood there in shock, struggling to find the nerve to react. After what felt like forever, I finally pushed myself to say something. "Who are you?" My voice came out quieter than I intended, barely more than a croak, but it was enough to break the silence. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, a dark shape in the doorway, like it was waiting for something. The stillness of it was almost worse than if it had moved. There was something unnatural about how it just remained, motionless, without a sound. I took another step back, my legs shaking. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. Something about this moment felt final, like I had reached the point of no return. I needed to know what this was, what had been haunting me ever since I moved in. I forced myself to speak again, louder this time, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you Michael Harris?" The second the name left my lips, the figure shifted. It was subtle, just a slight tilt of the head, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The name had meant something. I felt it, like the air in the room had suddenly changed, like a weight had lifted, or maybe shifted. The figure still didn't speak, but its attention was unmistakable. It was as if I had acknowledged something that had been waiting to be seen. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I was more terrified or relieved. Terrified, because whatever this was, it had just responded to me. Relieved, because at least now I knew I wasn't losing my mind. I hadn't been imagining the strange noises, the sense of being watched. This thing, this presence, had been here all along. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If this was Michael Harris, if this was some remnant of his life, then maybe there was a way to help him. Maybe he was stuck here, lingering in the apartment, unable to move on because no one had noticed him in life, and now no one was paying attention in death. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you here?" The figure didn't move again, but the air around me felt charged, like the space was holding its breath. I realized then that the sound I had been hearing, the rhythmic, breathing-like pulse, had completely stopped. The apartment was eerily silent, as if everything had gone still, waiting for something to happen. I took another step back, and as I did, the figure seemed to fade slightly, as if it were being pulled away. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The doorway was empty. I stood there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to make sense of it. I had seen it. I had seen something, but now it was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet apartment. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been, but eventually my legs gave out, and I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. The adrenaline that had been coursing through me drained away, leaving me exhausted and confused. What had I just experienced? Was that really Michael Harris? Was I imagining things, or was this apartment truly haunted by some lingering presence? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the floor, every shift of light had me on edge, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. The apartment stayed unnervingly quiet, as if whatever had been haunting me had finally gone. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was in this apartment, whatever had been following me, I didn't want to find out any more than I already had. I packed my things in a frenzy, barely stopping to think, throwing clothes and belongings into bags as fast as I could. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. It's been a few months since I left the apartment, and I still think about it sometimes. About the figure, about the sound, about Michael Harris. I don't know what it was that I saw or why it was there, but I do know one thing. Some places hold on to the past in ways we can't explain. And sometimes, the past doesn't want to be forgotten. I moved to a new apartment across town, one with bright windows and modern fixtures, a place that feels fresh and clean. I haven't heard any strange sounds here, no rhythmic pulses or mysterious figures watching me from doorways. Life has returned to normal, or at least as normal as it can be after an experience like that. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I can't help but listen, just to make sure. And every so often I think I hear something. A faint, steady sound, like someone breathing. My 2-year-old son Carter has always been what the doctors called a normal toddler. Like any other kid his age, he sometimes had tantrums or splattered his food all over the wall. Occasionally he caught a fever from eating God knows what, or refused to go to sleep until after midnight. What comforted my wife Annabelle and I was the knowledge that all of that was normal. By and large, our son was healthy, happy, and growing more every day. Until he woke up screaming 4 nights ago. At first I thought it had to do with the move. We had recently transitioned from a cramped apartment in the city to a 2-story house in the suburbs. The whole neighborhood had been built in the 1950s, and it showed. Every one of the homes was eerily similar to each of the others, and all of them needed repairs. Still, the bones of the structure were solid. So what if there were a few leaks in the basement? So what if the lights didn't work in the upstairs hallway? The important thing was that our little family finally had a place that we could call our own. Or so I thought. The truth was, Annabelle and I were both expecting that Carter would have trouble adjusting to our new home. We had read books about children whose personalities changed or even suffered trauma as a result of being suddenly uprooted from a familiar environment. But Carter was thrilled by the change. He zoomed through the house, yelling excitedly into every closet and cupboard. To us, the worn old house felt small, but for our son, it must have seemed like the biggest playground ever. He slept 12 hours that night, and Annabelle and I finally got some time alone. Carter was just as enchanted by the house on the second day. While Annabelle and I unpacked, he built forts with cardboard boxes or climbed around inside the kitchen cabinets. We let Carter pick his bedroom, and he chose the smaller room on the left. When I asked him why, he just grinned. "Funny doors," Carter laughed, then ran away without any further explanation. I was left scratching my head. My son's room had only one door, the one that led to the hallway and to the bedroom I would be sharing with Annabelle. Why had Carter said doors? I figured that it was just toddler logic and forgot all about it. My wife traveled a lot for work, but she had taken a week off to help with the move. Since he showed every sign of being well adjusted, she left for her first business trip last Monday. And that's where the trouble started. It had been a perfectly ordinary night. Beef stew for dinner, bath time, pajamas, story time, and sleep. While Carter dozed, I wrapped up in the cozy plaid bathrobe that Annabelle had bought me last Father's Day and read an old Raymond Chandler novel until I felt sleepy enough to turn out the light. A piercing shriek woke me. Carter, the digital alarm clock beside my bed, read 1:44 a.m. I stumbled out of bed and down the lightless hallway to my son's room. I found him standing in his crib, pointing at the wall and screaming. This wasn't teething pain, hunger, or a stomachache. This was pure, unfiltered terror. "What's the matter, buddy?" I asked as I picked him up. "Does something hurt? Did you have a nightmare?" "Da run," Carter mumbled over and over. "Bama da run." My son can usually speak complete words without a problem, but he was too agitated that night. It took 10 minutes of rocking just to stop the screaming, and even then, I still couldn't make out what he was trying to say through his tears. I offered water, a snack, and even told him that he could stay with me in the big bed if he wanted. But Carter just shook his head. There didn't seem to be any option except to lay him back in his crib. My son grabbed his favorite stuffed animal, a fat purple gecko, and rolled over, staring at the wall like his life depended on it. After a few minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing regulated, and I could finally get back to sleep. Although Annabelle wasn't around to witness the weird event, I mentioned it during our video call the next evening. Her advice was simple: give it one more night. If something else happened, I could move Carter's crib into our bedroom or set up the baby cam that we had quit using several months before. That second night was the first time that Carter had ever seemed nervous about going to bed, even while I was giving him his bath. He kept craning his neck to look behind me, as though he were afraid some monster was going to come creeping in from the hallway. Even after I shut the bathroom door, his tiny fingers kept a white knuckle grip on the edge of the tub, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. "Just holler if you need anything, okay, buddy?" I reminded him, before ruffling his hair and turning out the light. "Sleep tight." When I got back to my bedroom, I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder. Carter was just a black lump in the crib on the far wall. He looked so small and fragile, clinging to his purple gecko plushie like his life depended on it. I wanted to stay by his side, but I knew that I couldn't be there every night, and that some battles he would have to learn to fight alone. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, too restless to sleep. I was waiting, I realized, for my son to scream. After 1:45 a.m. passed without a sound from Carter's room, I finally relaxed. Maybe it had just been a nightmare after all. At some point I must have dozed off, because when my eyes opened, it was to the sound of my son's piercing cry. Just like before, I ran to Carter, but what I saw in the hallway stopped me in my tracks. It was me, standing in the dimly lit doorway of my son's room. This version of me had wild hair, bloodshot eyes, and an enraged expression on its face. "Hey!" I shouted, sprinting forward. My other self moved too, and only then did I realize that I was looking at a mirror. There was a full-length mirror on the back of Carter's bedroom door. I had never noticed it before, but then again, we had moved in so recently. A cheap mirror on the back of a door would have been an easy thing for the old owners to forget. And since Annabelle and I rarely opened Carter's door all the way, we might have simply overlooked it. Maybe that had been the problem. My son was waking up in the middle of the night and getting scared by his own reflection. As much as I wanted to believe it, I couldn't help but wonder what had opened the door. Something else was bothering me, too. Carter's stuffed purple gecko was gone. Sometimes he threw it out of the crib, where it usually bounced under the mattress or got lost in the laundry. But that night, the plushie was nowhere to be found. "Bah, Ma!" Carter was rambling again. "Durham!" He wasn't making any more sense than he had the day before, but at least he calmed down faster. He reached out for his crib, like he couldn't wait to get back inside of it and hide beneath the covers. Anything else I offered him only made that horrible wailing start up again. Although I didn't like the way he lay there, the sheet half covering his face like a murder victim in a mortuary, it seemed to be the only thing keeping him calm and relaxed. He was hiding, I realized with a shiver, hoping that whatever had scared him so badly wouldn't find him before the morning. The dark hallway connecting our rooms was also colder than I remembered. I put on the striped bathrobe that Annabelle had bought me last Father's Day and lay down on my bed to read. I wanted to get lost in those dusty yellowed pages, but I just couldn't focus. For one thing, my bookmark wasn't where I remembered leaving it. I had to go back almost 10 pages just to remember what was going on. For another, I would have sworn that my bathrobe had been plaid, not striped. No matter how many times I paced the bedroom or peeked out the door to make sure that Carter was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that had burrowed down deep into my gut. During my video call with Annabelle the next day, I was almost afraid to mention the whole episode. She still had a full day left in her business trip, and I didn't want her to think that I was losing my grip on things back home. I asked about the mirror, but she said she couldn't remember seeing one in Carter's room. Later, when I mentioned the bathrobe, an odd expression crossed her face. The truth is, I couldn't decide. I had narrowed it down to those two patterns, but I was running late, so I just closed my eyes and picked one at random. It turned out to be stripes, but it could just as easily have been plaid. Annabelle hesitated. Anyway, about Carter, why don't you just set up the baby monitor? That way you'll know for sure what's going on in there. We still hadn't fully unpacked, and it took me a while to locate the tiny camera that we had used to watch Carter when he was a newborn. I set it up on a chair facing his crib, and while I was at it, I also took down the mirror. I couldn't explain why, but the damn thing gave me a bad vibe, like it wasn't supposed to be there, like it didn't really belong in our house. Just like the night before, Carter became unusually quiet after sunset. He kept his eyes glued to the clock, nervously counting down the minutes until nightfall. I tried to distract him with his favorite game, hide and seek, but he didn't want to leave my side. I could understand why. Without Annabelle around, the house felt too quiet. Our voices echoed strangely in the half-empty rooms, and I think we were both relieved when it was finally time for bed. Carter rolled over to look at the wall as soon as I laid him in his crib. I had the unsettling thought that he was just pretending to sleep, but I was too exhausted from the day to do anything about it. I skipped my nightly routine, instead taking a shot of bourbon to calm my nerves and sitting down in front of the computer monitor. From there, I could watch the night vision footage from the room at the end of the hall. At first, there was nothing to see but Carter tossing and turning in his sleep, his hands grasping unconsciously for his missing toy. I poured myself another shot. When I looked back at the screen, my son's eyes were wide open. In the dark, they looked like two black, empty pits. His jaw dropped in terror at the sight of something behind the camera, something that I couldn't see. The camera fell to the floor with a crash. My son disappeared from view. I fumbled uselessly for a weapon, and finding none ran down the hallway empty-handed. What I found on the other side of the tightly closed door was the last thing I expected. My son was sleeping peacefully. Only the camera had been disturbed. It lay on its side, its wiry plastic guts scattered across the hardwood. Beside it was Carter's stuffed purple gecko. Was it possible that my son had found his stuffed animal, hurled it across the room to destroy our nanny Cam, then fallen back asleep immediately? Maybe. It was even the most logical explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it. The more I tried to convince myself, the more certain I was that there was an intruder in my son's room. Almost unwillingly, I turned my head from side to side, searching. My eyes fixed on the wall beside me, the one Carter had been looking at in the video. There was a second doorway there. I blinked. To my right was the hallway I had come from. I could see the soft yellow light of my bedside lamp glowing beneath the door. To my left was another hallway, one that I was sure hadn't been there a few hours ago. It looked as lightless and empty as the void of space. Was that what my son had been trying to say? Dark room. If so, what did Bar-Ma mean? I was curious because now that I thought about it, Carter's words had sounded an awful lot like bad man. Dark room, bad man, I shuddered. Before I could decide what to do about the impossible doorway, I heard footsteps approaching from the other side. I glanced down at my son, sleeping soundly, Whatever was out there, the most important thing was protecting Carter. I scooped him up from his crib and rushed back to my own bedroom. While Carter squirmed and asked what was going on, I barred the door with a chair, pressed my eye to the keyhole and listened. A man-sized figure stood in the doorway of Carter's room. It hesitated for a moment, then charged. Between its speed and the darkness, I couldn't make out any of its features, but whatever it was strong. It shook the door handle so hard that I thought it would rip it clear out of the wood. When that didn't work, it started slamming its bulk furiously against the door. The first impact made the door rattle on its hinges, the second splintered the wood. I doubted the door would survive a third. I had already dialed the police. I left the phone on speaker mode while I grabbed Carter, covered his mouth with my hand, and crawled beneath the bed. It was a silly, obvious place to hide, but it was all I could think of to do. "Shh," I begged my son. We hid in silence as 911, "What's your emergency?" became "Remain on the line, and the nearest available officer will respond to your call." The lock held for a little while at least. A final blow sent the chair I had braced it with flying across the room. I could hear ragged, panting breaths in the darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath heavy footsteps. I held Carter close and prepared for the worst. Sirens! My eyes snapped open. Flashing red and blue lights poured in through the windows. The intruder froze, muttered something in disbelief, then fled back down the hallway. From the first floor I heard urgent knocking. Shouts of "Police!" and "Open up!" reverberated through the house. I hurried downstairs with Carter before they could kick in the door. The officers cleared the whole house, but there was no sign of any intruder or the strange doorway. I didn't mention Carter's dark room in the report I filed. I didn't want to risk being deemed mentally incompetent or a danger to my son. The officers were already suspicious of the bourbon on my breath. The only thing to support my story was my bedroom door, which hung from its splintered hinges like a drunk clinging to a lamppost. And of course, I could have done that myself. More than anything, I missed Annabelle. Fortunately, I would be picking her up from the airport in just a few hours. As the sun came up, I fed Carter his oatmeal and booked us a bland, boring hotel room for the next 2 days. There was no way in hell I was going to risk my son's life by spending another night in that house. I packed as quickly as I could, sure that I had forgotten at least half the things that my son needed for 2 days out of the house. I kept getting distracted. What if I glanced up from the suitcase and found that Carter or the closet door had disappeared? What if, when we tried to leave, the house didn't let us? I gripped Carter's wrist and kept my eyes straight ahead as we marched out of the house. If some awful grinning face was watching us from the upstairs window, I didn't want to know about it. After the engine started, I could breathe again. We were going to make it. It was raining when we picked Annabelle up from the airport. A grey, misty rain that made everything that had happened in the last few days feel somehow less real. My wife looked dubiously at the half-zipped suitcases stuffed into the back seat, then at Carter's confused, tear-streaked face. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she wasn't convinced by my story. It hurt, but I couldn't say I blamed her. After all, which was more likely? That stress from work, a move, and caring for a toddler had caused a mental breakdown, or that a portal to nowhere had opened up in a boring suburban home. The only question now was whether Annabelle would stay by my side in spite of her doubts, or try to get as far away from me as possible. When we entered the lobby of the hotel I'd booked, my heart was in my throat. If she asked the desk clerk to call Child Protective Services or alert the authorities, there would be nothing I could do. I would be locked away until my name was cleared, and Annabelle would be free to take Carter back to that house. I could sense her doubt as we walked up to the front desk, but all Annabelle did was smile and ask for the keys. My wife had chosen to stand by me. So what if the air smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning supplies? So what if the ice machine's rattle went right through the paper-thin walls? As far as I was concerned, the hotel room meant safety. It meant an end to sleepless nights spent running down that lightless hallway, unsure of what I might find on the far end. I could have cried for joy. I dumped the suitcases and threw myself onto one of the ugly beds. Carter climbed up too, giggling and tickling me. For a few seconds I could almost pretend we were a normal, happy family again. Annabelle, however, stayed silent. "What?" I whispered, after we had turned on the television to distract Carter. "It's just..." My wife hesitated. "You're different." "Different?" I peeked through the bathroom door at the mirror. My hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under my eyes, but none of that was news to me. "Different how?" "I don't know," Annabelle shouted so loudly that Carter looked up from his cartoons. She brought a hand to her forehead. All this is just a lot, okay? I need time. But until that moment, I hadn't had a plan, but what I needed to do was suddenly crystal clear. I understand. That's why I'm going back to the house tonight. My wife opened her mouth to protest, but I shook my head. It's better for all of us this way. Carter had turned back to the TV screen, where a frightened white rabbit was running up an endless flight of stairs, pursued by an axe-wielding devil wearing a jester's cap. I had never seen the program before, and while it was probably supposed to be funny, under the circumstances it sent a shiver up my spine. I picked up my overnight bag, gave Annabelle a kiss on the cheek, then left the hotel room. Terror seized me the moment the door closed. What if I had made an unforgivable mistake? I was suddenly sure that if I opened the door again, I would discover that my wife and child had vanished, swallowed by whatever strangeness was pursuing our family. I had to know. I fumbled with the keycard, tugging on the door handle desperately, while that damned little light flashed red again and again. When I finally crashed inside, I found Annabelle with one arm around Carter's shoulder. She was ready to protect him, but not from any horror movie monster. She was ready to protect him from me. Sorry, I stammered. I just forgot something. The nearest thing at hand was a free disposable coffee cup. I grabbed it and stumbled back out into the hotel like a sleepwalker. Since Annabelle would need the car, I took a taxi home. The rain was coming down harder than ever, but it felt like the driver spent more time checking me out in the rearview mirror than watching the road. "What?" I demanded when he finally came to a stop in my driveway. "Nothing." The man looked down at the meter. "42.75, please." I stuffed a 50 into his hand and told him to keep the change. Inside, the house felt far too quiet. The taxi driver was still idling in my driveway, almost like he was waiting for me to change my mind. What had he seen? What had he been staring at so intently in the rearview mirror? I closed the blinds and tiptoed upstairs. I wished that I'd brought something to protect myself with, even just a kitchen knife or a hammer. But it was too late now. The door to Carter's room stood wide open at the end of the hall. Around dinner time, I called to check up on Annabelle and Carter. They were both fine, if a little shaken up. Carter had enjoyed exploring the hotel and splashing in the pool. They had gotten Chinese takeout for dinner. When I told my wife what I was planning, her reply was immediate. "I really wish you wouldn't." "Why not?" I demanded. "What do you think is going to happen?" Carter hooted excitedly in the background. At his age, that couldn't mean anything good. He had probably found an electrical outlet and a fork to stick into it. "I should go," my wife whispered, then hung up. Although I knew she had to take care of Carter, it didn't feel like that was why she got off the phone. It seemed a lot more like she was trying to avoid my question. Sighing, I looked over my setup. A chair hidden behind the door, a cell phone ready to record, facing my son's crib, a baseball bat, a pocket knife, and duct tape. You never know, I figured. I had filled the disposable cup I'd gotten from the hotel to the brim with strong coffee, and I sipped it slowly while I watched the sun go down. The past 3 days had been exhausting, but I couldn't use anything that might create light or sound to keep myself awake. I didn't want to do anything that might change the pattern of the past several nights. I must not fall asleep, I repeated to myself. No matter what, I must not fall asleep. When my eyes snapped open, my watch read 4:17 a.m. Over 2 hours had passed since I'd last checked. It was possible that I had missed the whole thing. Without remembering the need for silence, I sprang to my feet and scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. But there was a new, lightless hallway leading into the wall behind me. I turned, barely daring to breathe. I could feel the cool air pouring out of the impossible space, chilling the sweat on my skin. Gripping my baseball bat, I stepped forward into the darkness. I had decided not to use any light source. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, and I could feel my way along the corridor just fine. The rough paint was familiar beneath my fingertips. This could have been the same corridor that led to my bedroom, except that it hadn't been there just a few hours ago. I knew that there was a room at the end of the hallway, only because a light suddenly switched on behind its door. I pressed myself against the wall, waiting. There was movement inside. The door swung open. A dark figure stood backlit by a lamp. It ran a hand through its hair, shouted something, and hurried past me toward my son's bedroom. I held my breath as it passed, but there was no need. It was too distracted to notice my presence in the dark. After the figure passed, I slipped into the well-lit room ahead. I needed to know where it had come from, what it was, and what it wanted with my son. The last thing I had expected was to find myself back in my own bedroom, the plaid bathrobe hanging from the bathroom door, the digital alarm clock, the stack of towels on the dresser. Everything was the same. Or was it? The view out the window was unchanged, but it was covered by curtains. They looked identical to the ones that were still boxed up in the garage because I had never gotten around to hanging them. My Raymond Chandler novel was on the nightstand, but the bookmark was all the way back in the first chapter. What the hell was happening to me? Something in the hallway was coming toward me, muttering. Even though I was armed, I didn't want to risk a confrontation, not until I had a better idea of what was going on. The closet was half open, and I ducked inside, pressing into a wall of familiar yet unfamiliar clothes. Through the cracked open closet door, I could finally get a full view of the thing that had been frightening my son. It was like looking into that mirror, worse in a way because the thing in that bedroom wasn't just my reflection, it was me. Its voice was still distorted, but now I could make out what it was saying. "Carter, where are you, buddy? This isn't funny." The thing that looked like me scratched its head and stroked its 3-day growth of beard, tossing aside pillows, checking under the bed. What would I do when it got to the closet? It left my line of sight. I lifted the bat, my hands slick with sweat. Seconds later it reappeared, a glowing screen in its hand. "Carter! Carter!" it yelled, jogging back out of the bedroom. It was doing exactly what I would have done, making one last sweep of the house, then calling the police. If I wanted to get out of whatever this was and back to my own reality, I realized my time was running out. I took a deep breath and slipped back into the hallway. Somewhere in the darkness, maybe on the first floor of this eerily similar house, I could hear my own disembodied voice, shouting for my son. As I walked, those panicked cries became warped and distorted. Finally, they faded altogether. I could see my son's bedroom up ahead, his crib on the opposite wall, the purple gecko plushie, and the shattered camera on the floor beside it. I was almost there, but the corridor was longer than I remembered. It stretched out beneath my feet like some kind of nightmarish treadmill. The distance between me and the world I knew might be as short as a few feet, or longer than the distance between stars. There was no way to know. From my left, the beam of a wildly waving flashlight illuminated the ceiling. "Hey, stop right there!" someone was shouting. "Hey!" It was coming from the first floor, from the bottom of the stairs in the middle of the hallway. In the shaking flashlight glow, my own face stared furiously up at me. Instead of a baseball bat, this version of me was armed with a butcher knife. "What did you do with my son, you bastard?" It snarled, then lunged. I realized that something about its presence had readjusted the weird space I was trapped in. Suddenly I was making progress again. Carter's room was still dead ahead. I sprinted as hard as I could and felt the air change when I crossed over. I didn't turn around until I was beside my son's empty crib, but even so, I knew what I would find behind me. A bare wall. Somewhere out there, beyond impossible distances of space and time, my pursuer was probably about to burst confusedly into its own version of Carter's room. From his perspective, I was the bad man who had come creeping out of a dark room. In my bedroom at the end of the hallway, I could see my phone on its charging station. I hurried back to it, eager to tell Annabelle what I had discovered, until I remembered that my phone should have been set up to record on a chair in Carter's bedroom. Wherever or whatever this place was, it wasn't the same place I had started from. There was movement downstairs, keys jangling, turning in a lock. Somebody was about to come through the front door. I grabbed my bat and crept to the top of the stairs. A dark shape stood on the porch, backlit by the outdoor lamp. It put its keys away, sighed, then stepped inside and turned on the lights. "Annabelle!" I gasped. After so much darkness, the brightness from the first floor was blinding. My wife glared up at me, her face a mix of concern and anger. "You were supposed to pick me up at the airport 4 hours ago. Is everything all right? Where's Carter?" My mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. How could I explain that Carter was with another Annabelle, in another world, where we were strangers? Even if I could have found the right words, I already knew that she wouldn't believe me. I wish I could say that this story had a happy ending. I wish I could say that when I returned to Carter's room, I found a passage back to the world where I had left him, instead of 4 bare white walls. But that isn't what happened. Instead, I'm going to be back in this room tonight, waiting, hoping to find a way back to my son, hoping that I won't wake up with my own enraged face staring down at me and a knife at my throat. I'd like this story to serve as a warning. Maybe one day you'll be visiting a distant relative or a new friend, or maybe even unpacking boxes in a new home of your own. You'll turn around and notice a door where you were sure there wasn't one before. You might see a familiar-looking room on the other side. You might see a friend, a loved one, or even yourself. You might be tempted to take a walk down that dark corridor. If you do, just make sure that you're aware of the consequences. I didn't really expect the mysterious corridor to be there waiting for me, but I was almost disappointed to discover that my son's room was just an ordinary bedroom. 4 white walls, bare hardwood floors, big wide windows. Would it remain that way after nightfall? There was only one way to find out. I started making my preparations right away.